detention of a foreign bank account. Restricting financial freedoms is a significant step towards government control over individual wealth. When citizens are unable to move their money freely, they are essentially trapped by the state's economic policies, unable to protect their assets from inflation, excessive taxation, or confiscation. Restrictions are a hallmark of authoritarian regimes as they prevent citizens from safeguarding their assets against government overreach. Number 2, abolition of private ownership of handguns. Disarming the populace has historically been a precursor to government overreach. When citizens are unable to defend themselves, they become more vulnerable to coercion and control by the state. In states like California and New York, there has been a strong push for gun control laws that include bans on certain types of firearms, such as assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Number 3, detention of individuals without judicial process. The ability to detain individuals without due process is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. It allows the state to suppress dissent by imprisoning people without the need for evidence or a fair trial, undermining the rule of law. The National Defense Authoritarian Act, NDAA, of 2012 included provisions that allow for the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens suspected of terrorism without trial. This legislation was passed by a Republican-led Congress and signed by President Obama. Both parties were complicit in this erosion. Number 4, requirements that private financial transactions be keyed to Social Security numbers or other government identification. Linking financial transactions to government identification increases the state's ability to monitor, control, and potentially freeze individual financial activities. This kind of surveillance can be used to suppress dissent by targeting the financial lifelines of those who oppose the government. The Real ID Act of 2005, passed by a Republican-led Congress and signed by President George W. Bush, set the stage for increased government oversight of personal identification and financial transactions. Number 5, use of compulsory education laws to forbid attendance at private schools. Education is a powerful tool for shaping ideology. When the state controls education, it can impose its own values and suppress alternative viewpoints. Banning private education or heavily regulating it restricts parental choice and can be used to indoctrinate children. Number 6, compulsory non-military service. Compulsory service, whether military or non-military, can represent an infringement on personal freedom. It forces individuals to participate in state-directed activities, which can be used to instill loyalty to the government or to support state projects that individuals may not personally agree with. The idea of compulsory national service has been proposed by various politicians, including Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who advocates for a mandatory service program that would require citizens to engage in government-mandated activities. This proposal has also seen support from some Republicans. Number 7, compulsory psychological treatment for non-government workers or public school children. Mandating psychological treatment can be a form of state control over individuals' mental health and well-being. It can be used to suppress dissent by labeling those who oppose the government as mentally ill, or to enforce conformity through psychological interventions. There have been discussions about mandating mental health screenings in schools in the U.S., especially in response to increasing concerns about school shootings. while these proposals, often supported by Democratic lawmakers, are framed as safety measures, they also open the door to compulsory psychological treatment for children, which could also be expanded to other groups in the future, raising concerns about the state's control in personal mental health. Number 8, an official declaration that anti-communist organizations are subversive and subsequent legal action taken to suppress them. Labeling political opposition as subversive and using legal action to suppress it is a common tactic of authoritarian regimes. It allows the government to silence dissent and maintain power by criminalizing opposition groups. There has been an increasing trend in the U.S. to label certain groups, particularly those labeled the far right, as domestic terrorists or extremists. For example, the Biden administration has focused on combating domestic extremism, raising concerns about the potential for broader suppression of dissenting voices under the guise of national security. This includes actions like the Department of Justice's targeting of parents protesting school board decisions, which some argue could criminalize legitimate political activism. In Venezuela, the government has labeled oppositional parties and groups as subversive, using this as a justification for crackdowns and imprisonment of political opponents. This tactic is a hallmark of totalitarian regimes that seek to eliminate any challenge of their authority. Number 10. Any significant change in passport regulations to make passports more difficult to obtain. Making passports more difficult to obtain or use restricts freedom of movement. It can trap citizens within their own country, preventing them from escaping political persecution, economic hardship, or simply seeking better opportunities elsewhere. This is a classic tactic used by authoritarian regimes to control their populations. While the U.S. has not yet made significant changes to passport regulations, the REAL ID Act, passed by Republican-led Congress and signed by President George W. Bush, complicates domestic travel and could lead to more stringent controls over international travel in the future. The requirement for enhanced identification to board flights or enter federal buildings suggests a trend towards increased regulation of movement. Additionally, discussions about digital passports or health passports have raised concerns about the potential for increased governmental oversight and control over who can travel and under what conditions. Again, in countries like North Korea, obtaining a passport is nearly impossible for ordinary citizens, effectively imprisoning them within their country. Number 11. Wage and price controls, especially in a non-wartime situation. Wage and price controls are often used by governments to manage economic crises, but they can lead to significant distortions in the economy. These controls can cause shortages, black markets, and reduced investment, ultimately harming the very people that they are intending to help. Moreover, such controls represent a significant governmental intrusion into the free market, undermining economic freedom. Number 12. Any kind of compulsory registration with the government of where individuals work. Compulsory registration of employment with the government allows the state to monitor and control the workforce. It can be used to enforce conformity, suppress dissent, and limit economic freedom by dictating where and how people work. This kind of control over labor is a key feature of totalitarian regimes. Number 13. Any attempt to restrict freedom of movement. Restricting freedom of movement within a country is a clear violation of personal liberty. It allows the government to control where people live, work, and travel, which can be used to suppress dissent, enforce economic policies, or maintain political control. This kind of restriction is a common feature of authoritarian states. The recent pandemic saw unprecedented restrictions on movement within the United States and elsewhere. Quarantine orders, travel bans between states, and mandatory stay-at-home orders were implemented across the country and elsewhere, often with little regard for individual rights. Lastly, number 14. Any attempt to make a new major law by executive decree. Governing by executive decree bypasses the legislative process, centralizing power in the hands of a single individual or a group of individuals. This undermines the system of checks and balances that is fundamental to a democratic society, paving the way for authoritarian rule. In recent years, there has been an increasing reliance on executive orders to implement significant policy changes. For instance, President Biden's executive orders on issues such as student loan forgiveness and pandemic response, as well as President Trump's orders on immigration and trade, have bypassed the traditional legislative process. While executive orders are not new, their growing use to enact major policies without congressional approval raises concerns about the erosion of democratic governance. This trend, seen under both Republican and Democratic administrations, reflects a shift towards governance by decree rather than